What's good, family? Today on the menu, we're serving up something real. Something that might make you rethink everything you know about the NBA. We're always hearing how today's players are more skilled, more athletic, more everything. But let's flip that script for a minute. What if I told you that the players from the 80s and 90s might have been even more skilled than today's stars? Yeah, for real. Stick with me, and I'll show you how the game back then demanded a level of mastery that most of today's players don't even need to reach. We're talking about a time when the rules didn't favor the offensive player, when every bucket was earned through grit, skill, and pure fundamentals. Let's get into it. First off, let's talk about dribbling, something that's at the core of basketball. Today's game is all about handles. Players out here breaking ankles, chain together crossovers, step backs, and spins like it's nothing. But in the 80s and 90s, nah, man. You couldn't just palm the ball or cup it like players today do. Your hand had to stay on top of the rock, or it was a wrap. Straight up turnover. That changes the whole game. Players like Isiah Thomas and Tim Hardaway were out here putting defenders on skates with just pure, clean dribbling. No extra moves, no hesitation tricks where the ball sits in your hand too long. These dudes had to know where the ball was at every moment, and their timing had to be on point. Think about it. Today's players can manipulate the ball however they want, using their hands to control the dribble from side or even underneath the ball. That wasn't the case back then. You had to pound that rock hard and keep your hand on top, limiting your ability to shift directions quickly. So when you see old footage of Zeke slicing through defenses or Hardaway pulling off that killer crossover, you gotta respect that even more. They were playing with way less room for error and still making it look smooth. Now let's get real about scoring. Dropping 20, 30, 40 points in a game today, impressive, sure. But doing that in the 80s or 90s, that was a whole different grind. The offensive options were limited, the movement was restricted, and defenses were allowed to be way more physical. Back then, you just couldn't rely on spacing or the three-point shot like you can today. The three ball wasn't as prominent, and the paint was packed with bigs who weren't afraid to throw their weight around. You had to earn every point through pure fundamentals, perfect footwork, sharp shooting, and smart moving without the ball. And let's not forget how well these guys shot from mid-range. Players today are all about the three or the dunk, but back then, the mid-range was where you made your money. Guys like Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, and Dominique Wilkins were absolute killers from that era. They had to be, because the defense wasn't giving them anything else. Every shot was contested, every move was challenged, and if you weren't on point, you weren't scoring. So when you see players from that era dropping 30 or 40 in a game, understand that they had to work twice as hard to get those points. It wasn't about chucking up threes or blowing by a defender with ease. They had to master the art of scoring under pressure, with fewer tools at their disposal. Next, let's talk about footwork. Today's game is all about creativity. Euro steps, step backs, and all these flashy moves to get the crowd hyped. But back in the 80s and 90s, these moves wouldn't fly. They'd be called for traveling quicker than you could say bucket. Imagine James Harden trying to hit one of those signature step backs in the 90s. The refs back then would have blown the whistle and sent him to the bench. Even the Euro step, which we see almost every player use now, was considered a travel back then. Players had to stick to the basics, none of that extra stuff. But because they couldn't rely on these modern moves, they had to perfect their fundamental footwork. They had to be sharp with their pivots, quick with their first step, precise with their positioning. There was no room for error. If your footwork wasn't tight, you weren't getting past your defender. And it wasn't just about scoring. This applied to moving without the ball too. Players had to constantly be on the move, reading the defense, setting screens, cutting to the basket. These off-ball skills are something that's lacking in today's game, where too many players just stand around waiting for the ball. Back then, you had to be active, always looking for a way to make an impact without the rock in your hand. Alright, now let's flip it to the defensive side of the ball, hand checking. For those who don't know, hand checking was when a defender could put their hands on you and guide you where they want you to go. It was like playing with a weight on your back, and you had to fight through it just to get to your spot. Today's players don't have to deal with that. The rules now are all about protecting the offensive player. But back then, you had to be strong, quick, and smart just to move on the court. You couldn't rely on finesse alone. You had to simplify your moves, tighten up your handles, and focus on making strong, decisive plays. Players from the 80s and 90s couldn't just shake off a defender with a quick move. They had to plan their attack, use their body, and outthink their opponent. That's why when you see highlights of guys like Magic Johnson, Clyde Drexler, you're not just watching skill, you're watching mastery under pressure. And definitely, these players knew how to read the game like a book. They weren't just relying on athleticism to get stops. They understood positioning, angles, and timing in a way that today's players often don't. The hand-checking rules might have been a disadvantage on offense, but they forced players to be smarter and tougher on defense too. Let's keep it 100. Basketball in the 80s and 90s was a different beast when it came to physicality. Today's game is way more about speed and finesse, but back then, it was a grind. You had enforcers like Charles Barkley and Bill Laimbeer ready to knock your head off if you even thought about driving to the hoop. That meant players had to be mentally tough as well. They couldn't rely on the refs to bail them out, to foul every time they got bumped. Instead, they had to finish strong, keep their composure, and keep going back for more, no matter how many times they get hit. And let's not forget, there was no flagrant foul review system back then. You took your hits and kept it moving. The kind of toughness isn't just about strength, it's about skill too. The ability to perform under pressure, to stay focused when you're getting hammered. That's a skill in itself. Now here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Playing hard is a skill. And when you look back at the 80s and 90s, those players were on a different level when it came to effort and intensity. It wasn't just about showing up. It was about leaving everything on the court every single night. Today's game can be a bit more relaxed, with players pacing themselves through the season, resting for the playoffs and all that. Back in the day, there was no load management. Every game was a battle, and you had to bring your A game or you get exposed. Players from that era knew how to grind it out, how to dig deep when things got tough. They didn't have the luxury of coasting through games. They had to play hard on both ends of the floor from the opening to the final buzzer. That kind of relentless effort is a skill in itself, and it's something that set those players apart. When you see guys like Michael Jordan or Karl Malone playing 40 minutes a night, diving for loose balls, battling in the post, and still finding the energy to put up 30 or 40 points, you realize that playing hard is more than just physical. It's mental. It's about pushing yourself beyond your limits, game after game, season after season. So next time you hear one say today's players are more skilled, just remember, it's a different kind of skill. The players from the 80s and 90s were operating under a completely different set of rules, ones that made the game harder, more physical, and more demanding in a lot of ways. That doesn't mean today's players aren't great. They are. But we got to give props to the legends who did it under tougher conditions. They were out there balling with less freedom, more physicality, and a whole lot more obstacles in their way. So when you're watching these old highlights, don't see them as old school. You gotta see them as masters of a craft that was a whole lot tougher back in the day. These were players who didn't just rely on natural talents or favorable rules. They honed their skills to perfection, played with heart every night, and dominated in an era where nothing was given, everything was earned. And who knows, maybe if the rules were still the same, we see who the real skilled players are today. The game has evolved, but the grit, the grind, and the relentless work ethic of the 80s and 90s players set a standard that deserves respect. Thanks for watching, fam. If you're feeling what I'm saying, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Let me know who your favorite old school player is and why you think they can hang with today's stars. Until next time, peace out. And don't sleep on history, y'all. The 80s and 90s were a different era, and the players back then, straight up warriors on the court. It's time we give them the respect they deserve for mastering the game under some of the toughest conditions ever. Stay tuned for more real talk, and I'll catch you in the next one.